A warm welcome to all of you. I can see there are a lot of representatives also from the psychoanalytical societies in Vienna. I know that behind the screens are a lot of friends, colleagues, interested peoples and fans by Art Spiegelman. So we are very happy that you're all here today to join with us this event that is a cooperation between the Sigmund Freud Society and the Sigmund Freud Museum. And the event was initiated by the board of the society, its president, Martin Engelberg and Daniel Speer. We will hear, as you know, the renowned American artist, cartoonist, and comic author, Art Spiegelman, talking with the psychoanalyst and philosophical scientist, Ulrike Kadi, about comics, violence, and psychoanalysis. The dialogue takes place within the framework of our current special exhibition, curated by Marina Rauchenbacher and Daniela Finzi, and where also Spiegelman's comic is presented, Mouse, a survivor's tale, that you all know is called a work of the century. The dialogue will be about socio-political significance and comics, about violence and the overlaps between psychoanalysis and comics more in general. Our task as the Sigmund Freud Museum is not only to preserve Freud's heritage or to preserve the origin of psychoanalysis at Berggasse 19, where Freud worked and lived with his family almost half a century before he was forced to flee the Nazis in 1938. The Nazis that killed 4 of 5 of his sisters. And so you can see the task of the Freud Museum is at least twofold. First, to remember the darkest days of our history and the loss of humanity and culture. And the second is to prove the importance and the meaning of psychoanalysis for the current discourse on social and cultural issues of our times. So to sharpen our institutional profile, we have chosen something like a leitmotif for our annual programming after our opening in 2020. The first was Speak Freely. Last year, violence, and this year the theme is called absence. And I think all 3 annual themes are connected in a very special meaning with the artistic work of Art Spiegelman, and I don't think that this is a coincidence, like James Joyce would say. So let me come to an end. From my side, thank you again to the Society, Sigmund Freud Society. And before I hand over to Martin, and on behalf of the Freud Museum, I thank you very, very much, Art Spiegelman, for coming, and Françoise Mouly. We are very proud to have you here tonight and very much looking forward to the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, dear Monica, for this very warm introduction. And may I still start again with a warm welcome to you, Art Spiegelman, and Françoise Mouly, dear wife. It's really wonderful to have you here. It's your first time in Vienna, and it's wonderful to hear that you're having a good time. So again, a very warm welcome here in Vienna. So my name is Martin Engelberg. I'm president of the Freud Society. It was founded in 1968 and has set itself the goal of making the life and work of Sigmund Freud accessible to a broad public. And actually, exactly 20 years ago, you mentioned it today in our conversation, the Sigmund Freud Society was the donator of the Freud Museum Trust, and which now owns the building and is an independent trust operating here in that building. And now also a brief commercial from our side, from the Freud Society. It's open to anyone interested in psychoanalysis and the life and the work of Sigmund Freud. Mitgliedsformulare liegen draußen dann auf, wer noch nicht Mitglied ist. I already mentioned to you, Mr. Spiegelman, that I remember very vividly the discussions we had in the 80s about Maus coming out, and Maus, the Survivor's Tale. And actually, the term graphic novel only gained international awareness with your work, Maus.
I never liked the name.
By that time, I was on the board of the Jewish community, and we had really very hefty discussions on that. And I must say, I very much appreciated your work and defended it against some criticism. There was one particular criticism I liked most, is that the Poles were felt very insulted by being described as pigs. Mm-hmm. So I liked that very much, that the Poles were insulted by that. But, you know, it's also unbelievable how much it reflects also the time, because your Maus novel, because 2 years ago, even it stirred up again a controversy in the United States. Mm-hmm. I think at least in one state, the book was banned.
Yeah, it spread like AIDS, but it started
which is amazing. And it's not because 8th graders, where it would be shown, would be kind of overwhelmed by the story of the Holocaust, but it is about that there were, I think, pictures of nudity and
yes, one picture of a dead woman, my mother, in a bathtub filled with blood, very chastely drawn, very small, yeah. But I don't know what excites the sexual stirrings of the school boards of Tennessee, yes. But that was there for them. Yeah.
So it's unbelievable in the year 2022 or whatever that to happen. So we are all really very, very excited to hear more about your thoughts, not only about Maus, of course, but about cartoons and psychoanalysis in general. But before I hand over to you, to the panel, I'm also pleased to briefly introduce Professor Ulrike Kadi. Thank you very much for taking over that role here. She's a psychoanalyst and philosophical scientist. She works as a specialist in psychiatry and psychotherapeutic medicine at the Medical University of Vienna, and also in private practice, and has been publishing both as an author and as an editor. And now I'm more than happy to pass on the microphone to Ulrike Kadi and Art Spiegelman. Thank you very much.
Good evening, everybody. And a third time, welcome, Art Spiegelman.
Still okay to be here. I didn't know if it would be.
Welcome to Françoise Mouilly. We are very happy to have you here. And before we start our conversation, I just want to say that there will be some time for Q&A after our conversation. So keep your questions. Oh, it's too loud, isn't it? Keep your questions till then, but please keep them. And there is one not so good news. There is no signature session afterwards. No signing session. Okay. So now it's our turn. And you might expect me to introduce you to the audience, but during the preparation of our talk, it turned out that we have a lot to discuss.
Yes, be prepared to stay in your uncomfortable seats a little longer than the scheduled time.
And that's why I'd like to start with a few questions to introduce you. And I'm not going to ask these questions, well, why mice, why Holocaust, why comics, but there are three fields I'd like to point to. And these three fields are what was before Maus, what came after Maus, and how do you work, I'd say.
Okay.
You are famous, at least in Europe, for Maus.
Everywhere. Everything else I do is a footnote. I'm afraid that my obituary will say, Art Spiegelman, Pulitzer Prize winning author of Maus, died. Period. End of obituary. Because the other things don't stand in that kind of intense spotlight that, as Martin was saying earlier, seemed to put graphic novels on the map, even though I preferred calling them long comic books that needed a bookmark, but it wasn't as good a marketing term.
I see. Okay. We try hard not to put Maus in the center today. So, what was before Maus and what came after Maus? When and with what did you start?
Well, basically, like most cartoonists I know, comics for some reason imprinted on certain brains very strongly, and I was part of a generation that grew up with looking at certain things. So could you go to slide 3? You're on it. Okay. So for me, I learned to read from trying to understand if Batman was a good guy or a bad guy. He looked so menacing. And if I could understand the speech bubbles, maybe it would help. I learned about sex from Archie, a comic book about teenage dating. But I learned about feminism from Little Lulu, which was a very well-written comic strip when I was a kid. About economics from Uncle Scrooge. And philosophy and ethics from Peanuts, and aesthetics, psychology, politics, and all else from Mad. Mad was my gateway into American culture because my parents were both, they just came from outer space and landed in America, couldn't tell me much about it. But Mad could tell one everything about America. It was the codex, especially because we didn't have a television set in those early days. But this cover, when Mad was still a comic book, I saw it before I could read the stories inside this book, and it made a giant impression because the cover design is like Life magazine. So this was a news magazine like Signal, but a little bit different, if you know the World War II German magazine. It was a picture news magazine, and it had the voice of authority that maybe CNN might have now. So for this to be on a comic book, which is the lowest level on the food chain of printed matter in the 50s in America, and to be so subversive really affected a lot of people. For instance, here, this beautiful girl of the month, well, it's not so beautiful. And to have a drawing and a photograph mixed together was not common. So it was already synthesizing things that don't necessarily belong together to let you know that ultimately the message of Mad was the whole adult world is lying to you, and we here at Mad are of course part of that generation, so watch out. You have to figure it out for yourself. If we go to the next slide, these comics were among the ones that caused trouble in America in the 50s. They wanted to censor all comic books for children. They were afraid of them. But here we have one page from that comic book Mad, which was called Mickey Rodent by Walt Disney. And Mickey was a rodent. He had stubble on his face. He had rat traps attached to his fingers. The Disney police were pulling away Horace Horsecollar, one of the characters in Disneyland there, because he wasn't wearing the regulation white gloves. So that indicated something sinister in the world of Mickey Mouse. And that was, I guess, something that imprinted on me very quickly. The writer of this strip and the editor was also the editor of something called Two-Fisted Tales. These were war comics that came out during the Korean War, but weren't like the other war comics, which were like John Wayne doing it single-handedly. This was about mostly young kids terrified of dying in war. So if they weren't always pacifists, they were historically rather accurate. They had sympathy for the enemy in in the Korean War right after World War II. It went back and told the story of the Civil War, stories from other periods. And they were very humane, and Kurtzman, who was kind of a red diaper baby, had a point of view. And he also had a way of telling stories that to me was really something important about this work, aside from the content, which is, you know, in movies, there was this D.W. Griffith, who almost single-handedly gave us a grammar for comic storytelling. And Kurtzman, the guy who did Mickey Rodent and Two-Fisted Tales, was providing a grammar. Every page is a paragraph. Every row is a sentence. The panels had to be either 1, 2, 3, or 4 panels across. You couldn't change the height of the panels. It was all very methodically giving you the basics of a grammar for comics that hadn't been done by anybody else. The same publisher also published later, when all of the comics were under threat, something called Tales Designed to Have an Impact. It was after the horror comics that were published by the same publisher and the crime comics that were published by everybody, including them, were seen as really dangerous for children. So they wanted to put out comics that could have an impact but wouldn't get the censors upset. And as a result, there was one very obscure comic, Impact. It only had 3 issues, not a big following compared to the others, but it was the first time there was any kind of serious discussion of basically World War II, genocide, Auschwitz, in a comic book story. Only 6 or 8 pages by a painter who was slumming in comics named Bernard Krigstein, also inventing a brand new grammar of what could happen. And it was electrifying to me because it just wasn't part of the popular culture in 1954-55. So those were among the core influences. Of course, every comic, even the boring ones, were interesting to me because I just liked, rather than graphic novels, I thought of them as comics, C-O-M-I-X, which partially stood for the X-rated comics of the underground, but also a co-mixing of words and pictures. And that became especially important to me. Then when you ask where it all began, I realized that it really all began with a game that I was playing with my mother. Where did that go?
So that's the next one. This one.
Oh, yes. Okay, good. Right, over there. I did a collection of my early work called Breakdowns, and an introduction trying to explain how I became what I became. And I realized that when I was very little, like 4, 5, 6 years old, as an only child, my mother would try to find ways to amuse me, and she would start something called the scribble game. So she'd just make some arbitrary marks on a piece of paper, and it was my job to find some kind of image in the scribble that she made. And it gave me some feeling of competence that I could make marks on paper that people could understand. So it was when I was quite young. I won't read that whole strip to you, but it was the opening for this collection of breakdowns. And what's interesting to me now, when you ask what came after, there's a lot that came before and after, including working for a bubblegum company, making these nasty sticker cards, wacky packages, parodying ads, using the mad examples I got to go to another generation. Parodies of something called Cabbage Patch Kids, we did a series called The Garbage Pail Kids. It was the only real job I ever had working for this bubblegum company. And I think, you know, the subconscious is always at work here. The thing about Cabbage Patch Kids was they were orphans. And a kid had to get one and love it. And each one was slightly different, like they were made so that they weren't identically produced. And so it was nice that they made them very cute and lovable and winsome. But I thought Garbage Pail Kids was also an accurate phrase for these discarded kids that nobody could love. So I think that's somewhere in there. But then also I got involved in underground comics very early when the first bits of the underground press came along. And recently, after this trauma for me of 2 years of defending Mao's from censors, being involved with PEN America, doing public talks, helping to publicize what was going on, and being interviewed a lot and giving talks in libraries a lot, I was exhausted and had stopped drawing by the end of that time. So what I had to do is I had to learn how to draw all over again, which is much harder than riding a bicycle where you can just go back. And what I found that worked for me was making kind of blots on a piece of paper, because I did it by accident while making a watercolor, and then looked at the blots and saw what they could be, a little bit like Rorschach, and just made the picture that was being dictated by the blot. So number 6 is over there now. You can see on the left an iPhone photo of the blot that I started with, and then what I turned it into on the right, which was called Garden of Eden, No Boys Allowed. So It started something that I've been doing ever since the last year. Mostly the drawings I make are dictated by my subconscious and a blot on a piece of paper. So here was another one, number 7. This is a recent one, and it was just called Dawn. You can see dawn on the nose. And what came out of the blot that I found I was able to hallucinate on. And here's another one called Superman in the Blotosphere. Yeah. And I just had to find it in the blots. And for me, it was a way of taking dictation. So I didn't have to decide what to draw and then hammer it into shape. Usually when I work, which is why I brought all of these other slides with me, that weren't mouse, but just to show you the process that still is with me. Most comics, I can't get it right the first time. I can get a Rorschach test right because it's whatever it comes out to be. I'm drawing straight in ink and have a pipeline to taking dictation to make the picture. But usually if I have to make 2 people in a street and something overhead and a certain kind of car, it takes me many layers of drawing to find it. So first is the word, first is the idea. And
okay, let me.
First is the idea.
A point. So there's one small question. Do you paint with open eyes these blots, or do you shut your eyes?
I don't shut them, but I try to make it so I don't know which way is up. So I may make it horizontal and make a vertical picture. I may make it vertical and turn it upside down. And so I just look around for the most interesting thing that comes to mind. And very recently, I haven't followed through yet on this experiment. Francoise made some blots for me, so I have to use something where even my subconscious isn't involved till it lands on my drawing table.
Okay. So we have a first connection to psychoanalysis with your mother's scribble game that reminds us of Donald Winnicott's Squiggle game, a game was invented to get in touch with a child in a playful way. But before we talk about comics and violence as the topic of the current exhibition here in the Freud Museum, I would be interested to know, and you already hinted to it, what you have to do before a comic, a panel, leaves your desktop.
Yes, basically I have to torture myself. It's, drawing does not come very naturally to me. Doodling does, but drawing is harder when you know what it has to be and you have to make it look readable, legible quickly. So for me to do that and not just work on squiggles and on blots, I have to get a pretty coherent idea of what it is that I want to say, but not too clear, as Picasso said. You should always have an idea, but only a vague idea of what you're going to do. So when I was working on this thing for years, for 13 years, about my father, I had a vague idea of what I was going to do, and I had to structure it as I went along and go back and redo. In that work, I didn't know any 300-page stories, but I knew I was making something longer than a comic book story, and I had to figure out what language to use for such a thing. But for shorter strips, even then, I found one example that I made in 2014 or so that was published in the New Yorker as one page. Usually, could you go for a moment to slide number 17?
17 is this one.
So there was some kind of, when comic books were young, they weren't one story through the whole 32 or 64-page pamphlet. It was just a few stories. And sometimes when an advertisement that was expected didn't come through, or an artist made a story too short, they needed a filler page, just something to fill up the space. And usually they were pretty bland, banal, like whatever that thing is on the left, it's not very funny. But Harvey Kurtzman, the man I just told you about, got his start doing these one-pagers called Hey Look. And this is just one page, but it's actually the entire seed of Mad Comics, so that it's called Hey Look. But the first panel really looks like, I don't know how many of you are comics mavens here, but The Spirit was a very important comic influenced by the noir movies of his childhood. And it looks like that first panel with deep shadows and with the lettering built into the scene that said The Spirit. And it says, I'm reading here where this cartoonist Schmil Schmeisner does a takeoff in his cartoon strip. Next panel on the cartoon strip Schmil Schmabner by name by Schmal Schmepp, who does a takeoff on my ideal, Schick Schmacy, because there were parodies of Lil Abner that looked like Dick Tracy called Fearless Fosdick. My ideal, Schick Schmacy by Schmester Schmould, Chester Gould, who does a takeoff on Blondie by Schmick Shung, who just plain takes off like this. You know what I'm talking about? I don't. Now this was a parody of 5 things in a row, but I think in the comics language it's worth even slowing down, because I don't know if we'll ever get to the ones where I'm going to analyze panels in mouse. But here, the first panel is one horizontal going across. Mm-hmm. The second one, again, the same thing. The third one, the same. But on this last row, all of a sudden it's 2 panels rather than 1 as it accelerates, because this idea of taking off gets faster and faster, and the second one has no border around it, so he's just flying loose off the page. And this is a rhythm of acceleration, and that's the subtext for this. Very different than the stupid Warden Willis that's next to it. And now if we can go back to, let me see if I know how to do this again.
I think we should go back.
Yes, we have to go back to, 10. So I'm going to have to read you this page. I'm not going to read you most of the slides, or you'll be here till sometime after my plane leaves. But this was a page. This is the final result of the page. Lost. Have you seen my ball? Your balls? No, can't help you. Nice hat, though. Do you mind if I help myself? Huh? No, stop. Oh, groan. I lost my ball, I lost my hat, and now, sob, I'm lost. Lost, eh? Don't worry, I know where you live. Next row. See, that's your house, but why is there an ambulance? And then as he gets closer, I'm sorry, son, it's Mom. And there's an ambulance taking a body away. And then the worm says, hey, look, Oxo, I found your hat. So it's a light one-pager that just happens to deal with all of my losses. But it came as a kind of, I didn't have a reference for it, but I realized that I'm always losing my glasses, my notebook, my pen, my cigarette. So if I go for a minute out of order to show you, yes, number 15. This was from the same sketchbooks around the same time. On the left, I'm looking for my glasses. And on the right, I'm dealing with my loss of sexual energy in my 50s somewhere. It wasn't the same as when I was a kid. So these were the losses that were present for me. Now if we go back to where we were, number 11, I found in my notebook all of these preliminary things that led to the final result. One notebook that had a character named Oxo. If you look at his face, it was just a tic-tac-toe board, because really it's just a squiggle that makes up cartoon faces. So I found this as an interesting abstraction. Then, like I say, these other notebook things. And then the beginnings of this idea, done in little boxes in the upper right, and then a little more defined, that was basically what became that one-page Lost, although the rhythm of the panels was, of course, different. And in the second row, if you can see so small, there's a dog instead of a worm or a snake being the guru. So that was a way of defining the basic picture. Then on the second row, there's the original in black and white, which is made larger, which is maybe a separate question, larger, smaller. Did you want to ask that separately? Okay. Then I had to make a smaller copy of the black and white art and paint it in watercolor so that I could make a mistake and still make another copy on watercolor paper if I screwed it up. And that became the finished page. And next slide has some more notes about all these things, different breakdowns, different ideas for it. And something I totally forgot until you'd asked me to find. This is on the right-hand side of the page, and dealing with this lost hat, lost ball, etc. There's a scene that actually had been in Mouse. This was made in 2016 or 15. And it's about this character in Mouse, Mandelbaum, who didn't have shoes he could wear and would lose all of his stuff. And so he really needed something to stay alive. But I've lost my bowl. Can't help you. No bowl, no soup. But I'll help myself to your what, shorts maybe. Shoes, okay. I've lost everything. Lost. Not yet, I'll take you home. Then he's being brought to the crematoria. And somebody comes along and then says, good luck, I found your shoes. So it's the same joke made a lot less funny. Just made on, as I was discovering what I meant and why I was making this. But then to get to these finished drawings for the story I was giving myself to tell, which wanted to be like an innocuous filler page, these are just a bunch of panels that are rough sketches built not to be saved. Most of the time, in most of my life, I threw them out. But starting with Mao's, I began to systematically save the rough drafts as I was finding them. So I was just drawing in different colors to try to bring it into focus, and maybe to save paper I would do several different corrections on one and then move on, trace it onto the next until I found it. So on the left page it's just 1, 2, 3, 4, 6. It's about 8 pictures that became one panel in that one page, and it was trying to do that thing of locate how to make the meaning of the picture very easy to interpret, to read as a picture. So that was just a part of the process, and it helped me define what I was working on and finally do a finish that had control. This is what I lost in the past year or so, and I'm trying to get back through my blots, because it stops being fun after the 6th or 7th iteration, and in Mouse there could sometimes be 20 or 30 pictures for each panel, just one box on the page. So it was just what was required to make it look right. And then here, this is maybe interesting, number 16. After it came out, the much more literate than I am readers of the New Yorker said, "Oh, that's really interesting. It's like that Elizabeth Bishop poem." And I had to say, who's Elizabeth Bishop, which poem? And it was this very eloquent version of what I was trying to do with this one-page comic. One art. The art of losing isn't hard to master. So many things seem filled with the intent to be lost that their loss is no disaster. Lose something every day, except the fluster of lost door keys, the hour badly spent. The art of losing isn't hard to master. Then practice losing farther, losing faster, places and names, and where it was you meant to travel. None of these will bring disaster. I lost my mother's watch, and look, my last or next to last of 3 loved houses went. The art of losing isn't hard to master. I lost 2 cities, lovely ones, and vaster, some realms I owned, 2 rivers, a continent. I miss them, but it wasn't a disaster. Even losing you, the joking voice, a gesture I love, shan't have lied. It's evident the art of losing's not too hard to master, though it may look like, write it, like disaster. So, my poetry on the right, hers on the left.
Okay. So we'll change a little bit the topic and switch to the question of size.
Of scale or style?
Of scale and size. As I began to prepare for this interview, I realized once again how much I hadn't seen in all your pictures, in your comics. You are able to bring memory and experience to the point in comics in such a way that the reader can understand it instantly. But this goes hand in hand with the tendency to include much more in your depictions than can be quickly deciphered. When you were asked whether your comic excerpt could be enlarged for the exhibition in the Freud Museum, you did not agree. They should be exhibited in their original size, you said. Your comic book, In the Shadows of No Towers, which contains a comic strip from the German newspaper Die Zeit, is more than twice that big.
It's much bigger, yeah.
So what's the deal with the size of your comic?
Okay, well, each time I approach a comic, I have to find the way to draw it. The style doesn't stay. What my style is just my ineptness. Like one way or another you can say, oh yes, the hand is drawn badly, it must be by Spiegelman. But I try to find stylistic references, like the humor style of Lost, and in Mao's something that was inspired by a lot, but also, among other things, Franz Mazuril, if you know his work, woodcut artist, very brutal, strong, and feeling spontaneous even if it's built in many layers. I also knew that what I wanted to do with Mouse was more like writing than drawing, but it was included that co-mixing of words with the pictures. And to make it intimate, I decided I had to draw it the same size it was printed. So the book you might have of Mouse, that's the size of the page of drawings. and still with all of these layers of sketches to make up each tiny panel that was maybe 1.5 inches high. So there's no room for bullshit. There's no room for decoration. Everything had to have a meaning and to be there so it could be understood. And for that, it required the intimacy of a sheet of paper that you were holding that's the same as the one I was making my marks on. It would give it something different than when I was first experimenting. I made a much larger page and I was working in scratchboard, which looks like woodcuts or wood engravings. And I realized it was all wrong because what I was saying is, it looks like I can draw and you can't, so shut up and listen. And what was more important was to have more of an I-thou relationship with whoever was reading this thing. And so that meant working small and trying to find the impossible, which was something that was a cross between my handwriting and typography. That was, type is easier to read than handwriting. So the drawings had to be a cross between looking like they were casual and also being precise so that you could see exactly what was happening in each picture. So the scale is actually part of the project. It was mouse size. On the other hand, when you ask me about yes, here we have 3 projects. One that I just gave you, a tiny, tiny book, smaller than a pack of cigarettes. It came out in German. It was still small, but it was like the coffee table book compared to this size. So that project was meant to be casual, small, almost disposable by a writer I really admired, and I illustrated his book. And that was part of the casualness. It was still made 2.5 times larger than the less than a cigarette pack size, because otherwise I wouldn't be able to draw at all. And then I told you about Mouse, but the one that was made about September 11th in New York, I knew it took me a long time. September 12th came sometime in February of the next year, because we were down in ground zero. It was really genuinely, intimately disturbing. And I had a lot of confused thoughts, and I began thinking them on September 12th, which came around February 2nd of the next year. Proposed it to the New Yorker. They didn't want a series, so I was complaining to my friend Michael Naumann, who's the publisher of the first edition in Germany for Rowohlt. And he said, I will give you a no editor's clause, whatever you want, as long as it's not libelous, we'll publish it. And he said, how about once a week? I said, I don't know, I'll make it as I can. It was more like once every month or so. And I made it the size of Die Zeit, which was the size of the first comic strips in America. They came with Sunday newspapers. They were really large. And as a kid, they were bigger than you were. You could fall inside them. And that seemed appropriate. And this series of pages that I made, it's even present here, but it's an obscure strip. You won't know. There's a strip called The Incredible Upside Downs in the bottom third of blue, where you read the first 6 panels, turn it upside down, and read the second 6 panels. Mm-hmm. And at the end, there's a reference to one of the greatest of the Sunday comics, Little Nemo in Slumberland, about dreams by Winsor McCay. So since I was working that size, and early on, I realized, yes, could you go to slide number 22? This was the first panel of the first one, and it talks about feeling equally terrorized by Al-Qaeda and by my own government. Our hero looks over some ancient comic pages instead of working. He dozes off and relives his ringside seat to that day's disaster yet again, trying to figure out what he actually saw. So that was just the opening panel, and now if we go to the panel, to the one before, 21. This was the whole page, because yeah, okay, I guess that's it, yeah. So the page was really like a big Sunday page filled with, as some of the Sunday pages were, top strips and bottom strips, and all of them only having a kind of proximity to drive the different pieces forward. And I had to make it large to be a Sunday page, and I used many different stylistic devices to make the pages. And for that, I needed the scale to be really big. And so I don't even know what size I drew it, because I drew each piece kind of as a separate thing and then kind of made them pieced together at the end. And at that time I was using the computer more than I do now. They fortunately made it so complicated I have to draw on paper again. But at that time it was, this scrap might be smaller than life size and would have the brutality of being blown up. Another part of it might be very, very large and shrunk down. Some were same size, but it was different scales all meeting in the cacophony of the wake of 9/11. And when one editor saw it, he said, is your husband crazy? He thinks that Al-Qaeda and our president are the same size danger. And my response to my wife, at least, to Francoise, was, well, actually, you're right. The president is much more dangerous. He has a lot more money than Al-Qaeda to dispose of. So it wasn't a popular opinion at the time. It was published in Germany, it was published in France, in maybe 8 different countries. And there I was just seen as a representative of sanity from America. But in America, it took till 2004 before anybody would publish it on any scale at all.
Okay. So I'll skip one question because I think we are short of time, sort of.
I told you you'd be here long. Okay.
Yeah. So for the next question, I presume everybody in this room has read Maus. If not, you need to catch up as soon as possible. In comics, as in psychoanalysis, reality doesn't come first. Fantasies and imaginations play a major role in both. And your father's memory did not always correspond with historical research. I found it very impressive how you dealt with this in some of the panels in Maus. Could you comment a little on that?
Well, it's throughout the whole story. It's all secondhand, right? I wasn't there. So I had to do a lot of reading just to even get a sense of what he'd gone through and dig around in archives. When Francoise and I finally went to visit Auschwitz, I was so jealous of Steven Spielberg and the other filmmakers who could build new barracks on the ground of Birkenau and knew what it all looked like. So I had to photograph that to get a better idea of what they were looking at and whatever photographs I could find. But I had to do that and also do a lot of supplemental reading to understand what my father was telling me. And my job was to make sure it was always in the register of I'm being told a story and I'm trying to visualize it. Because I really wasn't trying to teach 8th graders in Tennessee or anybody else anything, including you must be nice, you must never do anything like this again, never again and again and again and again was my response to that. But nevertheless, I needed to teach myself how if you want to take the Freudian approach, I wanted to understand how the hell I got born when my parents were supposed to have been murdered before I was conceived. And that was the project, to re-inhabit this thing. And so as part of that, I had to make sure I was keeping it tweaked. Like when Maus was put on a bestseller list in the New York Times, it was put in the fiction side. And I said, wait, I worked so hard to have the rhythms of a novel without being able to take the freedoms that a novelist has, that I think I belong. If you had a section called literature and non-literature, I would take the literature side, but with fiction and non-fiction, wasn't comfortable for me to be there. And they discussed it for a while at the New York Times. I found out from a mole who was at the meeting and was a friend of mine, said, well, the publisher said it was non-fiction, because I talked to them about it. So they agreed to put it on the non-fiction side, but one person was really adamant. He said, no, we'll go down to Spiegelman's studio, we'll ring the bell. If a giant mouse answers the door, it goes immediately on non-fiction. But within my own scale of how things worked, I had to find a way to keep it honest one way or another. And this page that you just had up was an issue that came up for me. There's several times where things weren't so clear, like I couldn't understand why my father was answering the way he did. And one, as I was doing all my research, I said, so did you ever go past the orchestra in Auschwitz? And he looked totally confused. Orchestra? Why would there be an orchestra in Auschwitz? No, of course not. I don't know, but it's in almost all of the books that go in detail mention this orchestra, including memoirs of people who were in the orchestra. So no, there was no orchestra. So in the dialogue, as I broke it up on that first panel, I'm asking him, and I'm showing it as I understand it, that the orchestra is there, and the prisoners are walking past. And then when my father says, absolutely not, I just have them walking with no orchestra obviously visible, but behind, since it's my book, not his, I could insist that there was an orchestra by showing what was the side of the barracks and a little bit of the base and what would otherwise be a staff of notes where the building was, if you see what I mean, insisting there was an orchestra. So I got to have the last word and then we moved on. But I was wrong, and I now know this only for the last 2-3 years when I was thinking about Maus again. He never saw an orchestra. He was right, because he was brought in by truck, as exists later in the book, not on one of the big trains. The orchestras were placed at the receiving space. He was brought in by truck, brought in on one of the several side entrances to Auschwitz, and taken off there. And he never went out of the gates of Auschwitz till there was no longer an orchestra there when they were evacuating the camp. So it's interesting to have that dialogue as the example, because I'm arguing with him and, hey, I was wrong. But there are other places where I was right, but I had to insist. And I could only do this kind of back and forth once in a way where it would have to stand in for the process of trying to understand and make something of his memories.
So many of your comics are autobiographical, and I'd like to know if you feel primarily committed to a reality if you tell about yourself, or is drawing comics also a way for you to dream about how you would have liked to be, to invent sort of an autobiographical reality?
That's not how I do it. I mean, it's not,
Okay.
And I don't think of it as real or not real, because I'm still not sure if I'm in this room or not. You know, it's a different set of issues that may have to do with the philosophical part of your career. But really, I'm just trying to find out what's going on inside my head. And sometimes if I analyze myself, like that page I showed you about losing things, I thought it was just a strange joke. And then as I dived more into it, I saw it had an autobiographical connection in several different ways. Sometimes I did things that were surreal. Different times in my life I did just fictional jokes or comics. And I suppose I could find a connection, but it wasn't what I was thinking about. I was just trying to figure out how to make something on this subject work. Sometimes they were even biographies of other people that I would work on. Mm-hmm. So it wasn't divided up between real and not real so much as what's on my mind. And so there was I think we brought in somewhere...
Is one more slide, this on fiction? This one?
Okay. Yes, this one I would have to read. Do we have time to do that, or should I? Because I tend to talk a lot.
Well,
I could.
We can come back to it.
Let's come back to it if you're still not asleep. Good. Okay.
So now we can come back to our start. What originally motivated you to turn to drawing comics? Does it have to do with the desire for a forbidden topic? At first glance, sexuality didn't seem to play such a big role in your comics.
I think it's just because you didn't see the body of my work, and it's quite literal about bodies. I did a lot of, when underground comics started, it was about making the forbidden. That was what the job was. Politically forbidden things to say, sexually forbidden things, violence portrayed as graphically as one could, as repulsively as one could. And that was the mandate. The same way when I was working for a bubblegum company, the thing was to peddle bubblegum to children. So I had to find something that kids could like, and I'd have to go back to my own childhood to know what I liked when I was a kid and do it that way. But here, the sex comics, the first things I did, they were very specifically sex comics, number 29. I was still an apprentice. I was younger than the other underground cartoonists by about 4 or 5 years. And because they were doing really psychologically troubling, violent comics, and intentionally about castration, about murder. So I was trying to be like my older siblings in the underground comic field. I'm not proud of those now, but one is about, on the left, a one-page thing that was in a comic called Young Lust, about this guy finding a corpse on the street and then falling in love with the corpse and fucking her, but he's found by the police as if he had killed her, and he's in jail mourning her because he loved her so much. On the right-hand side, something especially Freudian. It was about a kid named Eddie Putz, and about this evil character, the Viper, who, by the time the story is done, Eddie has killed his father and held his mother down to be raped by the Viper, this symbol of evil, and then they walk off together arm in arm. I'm not proud of these, and they got more and more violent. This was the least violent of the Viper stories, but it was so violent that I'm very proud to say, if you know anything about underground comics, the most violent cartoonist, the one who brought that into the mix, was a cartoonist named S. Clay Wilson and his Pervert Pirates. They were really genuinely obscene. That was the point of them. And it affected Robert Crumb, made his work get more obscene in Zap Comics, and all of us were affected by it, so much so that what I'm proud to say is when I was invited over to his house, his wife wouldn't let me come. She said, it's okay if Wilson comes, but not Spiegelman, it's too much. I eventually found out I was just looking for violence and trauma in all the wrong places. And that's what turned me around and helped me found what became ultimately Maus.
Okay.
And more sexual stuff. This is a crumb one, the next one. This got the comic book Busted. The family that lays together stays together.
Which is very psychoanalytical.
Yes.
Yeah.
You know, well, Europe was brought up on, if not on fascism, on Freud a little bit, but mainly political issues, you know, Marx. And in America, it was almost all Freud, so that we wouldn't think about Marx. Okay, so I did something for Young Lust a few years later, which was deconstructing a love story. I found out how to tell a love story by reading a book on how to make stories. And I quote from it about how the love story is structured. And I keep interrupting it with drawings from a porno movie theater where there's a woman at the porno ticket booth, and down the street, a character, this is the second 2 pages, a character is a sign painter, and another character who knocks over the red paint, and it's like blood, but it's paint, and it connects the 2 characters. It's the only connection they have. So it's a kind of conceptual love story that gives you a startle when you first see it, but it actually, it's not like the parody romance comic stories that were in the rest of that comic book. So that was another version of it. Then when I worked for Playboy, I had much more innocent sex comics, like number 32. Slide? Yeah. Jack and Jane and Rod and Randy. So on top, achoo. Do you care for a tissue, miss? Why, yes, thank you. I guess the bus is late as usual. Late as usual, sniff. But meanwhile, on the second strip, Rod and Randy, it's their genitalia talking to each other. So, hey there, sweetie, how about blowing my nose? Beat it, buddy, beat it. That's all he ever does, says the genitals in this bottom half of Rod or Jack. Listen, she might have a cold, but I'll bet you're nice and hot. Tee-hee, you're cute. Why don't you come up and take my temperature? Achoo! Just another post-nasal drip. Okay, so lighter. Then this one, at some point I was able to do enough for them, so they let me just do things that were a little too artistic for Playboy, but they let it happen. Inspired by Mazariel and a lot of comics without words. It's just called A Shaggy Dog Story, and it's a woman with a dog. And finally, after they've had sex together, the door opens and her husband comes home. So that's the only examples I brought, I think, of that. But then, also, while I was doing Maus, next slide, number 34, I would take vacations between each chapter of Maus because it was pretty heavy and it would take me a long time to do a chapter. And I began doing a series of book covers for 2001. The Germans were very good at giving me no editor clauses, whatever I wanted. So this was for a book by Boris Vian, translated into German, called I Wouldn't Want to Croak on the left. And I don't remember the ones on the right so much. But each time I could make a cover, whichever I wanted. This was called, anyway, the top one was called Something in the Verokine and the Plankton, and the bottom book was called Mood Indigo. And so that was a spine in the middle, so you'd have a picture on the spine, and then a front and back cover as their bodies begin to dissolve together in the course of the book, and by the end, they're one amorphous blob together. So, and then I did, after Maus, I did a book called The Wild Party, which was a kind of erotic, hard-boiled poem written in the 1920s about a wild party. I was only supposed to do about 10 or 12 illustrations. I suggested the book to them at Pantheon, and they said, well, fine, 12 is fine. But when I got into it, it just wanted more and more, so I ended up doing about 60 illustrations for the poem. And I liked that each time you flipped a page, it would be a surprising layout, not predictably the picture only. And New Yorker, which is a more chaste magazine, the only ones I could find from my New Yorker 10 years included the first one I did, which was taking place in the wake of the Crown Heights race riots with a Hasidic Jew and a black Caribbean woman, which were the two populations that came to blows. And for Valentine's Day, I thought it would be nice if they could kiss and make up. But this created a giant stir, let's say, a controversy. And it was in a magazine that wasn't in the underground, so the controversy got bigger. And before the internet, this was about as big as anything could get. So it was international news at the time. On the right, it was, they were used to me by then, just a Valentine's Day cover a few years later. So just to indicate that there is an alternate history that's got some sexual content.
Okay, I got it. So I'd like to come back to violence. And what are your feelings about the fact that comics, which focus on violence, to create an opportunity to deal with violence and its consequences, that comics are to an extent discredited now? So what's your
Well, I think now it's changing. It was discredited for all of my life till the underground comics came along for a subculture and eventually became called graphic novels and have now become not only respectable, but one of the economic energy centers of bookstores, more and more. But at the time, when I was growing up, I grew up with a very sanitized comics. After the comic book scare of comic books were the cause of juvenile delinquency in the late 40s, early 50s, and they were getting very fantastical and rather violent and rather sexual very often. So let's see, should we start? Maybe, yes, for a second I'll just show you this part of the introduction to Breakdowns, number 38. But I won't read it to you because that'll take too long. But essentially, I was getting the more anodyne comics. And my father saw that I was reading them. He was very unhappy because they cost 10 cents each, and he could get them for between 2 and 5 cents as used comics near where he worked in the Diamond District. So at first he brought them to me, and I was glad to get a big stack for what would otherwise just have bought me 2.5 comic books for my allowance every week. And I'm looking at them and I'm going, these are lurid, truly troubling comics is the name of the comic on the lower left that I'm looking at. And then I'm seeing things I'd never seen before. A baseball game played with a sawed-off human legs, a chest, a torso used as the chest protector in baseball, the ball being a severed human head, the intestines making the baselines. This was just a horror comic made by EC, the same publisher I was talking about before. And these got everybody really upset. That this was when you talk about letting your id out and making it just fantasy, that was this. And they were meant to be sort of scary but funny, like campfire stories, but they really got some moral gatekeepers very unhappy. And so they were replaced by relatively insipid comics, which is the second page on the left. And if you can see the details, those are some of the comic books that were the most upsetting to the censors. There's a whole subgenre called headlight comics about women with big breasts often tied up. So anyway, but here's what some of them looked like more close up. 39. So this was some of those horror comics. And they didn't think this was the best thing for children to read. But I saw that not as something designed to pervert children, but as a secular Jewish response to the Holocaust. These were American Jews mostly. Comic books were made mostly by Jews because they were very poorly paid. They had no status whatsoever, quite the opposite. They weren't allowed in the upper precincts of illustration and advertising very often before World War II. So I see these comics, like the two larger pictures there, as the dead invading everyday life. The horror invade your daily life, which is what Auschwitz can conjure up, and the Holocaust. And then the dead coming back to life for revenge. These were the major themes of these horror comics. So I saw them as having a different weight. Meanwhile, there's this guy, slide 40, and here's where we get back to Freud pretty directly. There's a guy named Frederick Wertham. He was a psychiatrist who, when he was a young man in Germany, maybe in Vienna, I don't know.
In Nuremberg.
In Nuremberg, okay. Yeah. So he was a psychiatrist. He met with Freud he was still a student. He was working on neurology. He did a book called The Anatomy of the Brain, basically. But talking to Freud thought he should really devote his analytic energies to psychiatry and maybe go to America, and that convinced him to do that. He's a very complicated man, I think, and I've spent a lot of time thinking about him because when I was a kid, I hated him almost as much as the Nazis because he was single-handedly responsible for whipping up the hysteria that made the good comics disappear and be very clandestine and hard to find. The censoring of them was done very clumsily. It stopped things that were very subtle and actually valuable, like these war comics, and I think the satire comics of Mad. But what he did was, at that time, I hated him. I didn't know much about him except he wrote this book, next slide, called Seduction of the Innocent. Oops. I'm sorry, there it is, yeah. And this was a book interviewing children. Once he found out about comics, he was blind to them, and then wrote a whole book called Seduction of the Innocent and how comics and America's mass media in general was corrupting children with confusing sex with violence and exposing them to it in too raw a way. This was a small illustration in the book saying, in ordinary comic books, there are pictures within pictures for children who know how to look. So this muscle becomes a torso. And I found this book in a library when I was a kid. I stole it like any good juvenile delinquent. I still have it, these, 60 years later. And it really taught me to look carefully at comic books when I was just a kid. But for him, if we go back one, now I have these pictures, you can see them more clearly. These were among the worst things that one could expose children to. And the way he found out about it, and this is where I found out about the other side of this, what I saw as a monster was actually a very well-intended doctor. He opened up the first free clinic for black people in Harlem. He was known, I found out, as Dr. Quarter. It was an essay written by Ralph Ellison, important American writer who wrote The Invisible Man, about black people. And in that in that world, he was giving treatment for a quarter because he thought every patient should invest in their own cure rather than just take it for granted. But if they didn't have a quarter, they were allowed in anyway, and he gave therapy with a group of volunteer doctors because there wasn't any such place. There was only Bellevue, which was kind of a nightmare horror house of a mental institution for Harlem residents. Here, what he did, he was, if we're on number 40 again, maybe for a second, he started something called the Lafargue Institute. Lafargue was a nephew of Marx, very left-wing, who was living in Cuba, and he named it after him. And he was dealing with these black kids and finding out what their lives were like. And in the waiting room, you'd see them all fighting over the comic books. So one time he took the comic book to see what it was they were looking at, and he was genuinely disturbed. It was a Tarzan comic. Because Tarzan is about the white god and the black primitives, talk in broken English. And he realized that this was a conveyor of violence and of racism. And it started him on this crusade of lecturing about how he doesn't care what an adult reads. He only cares when it's an adult's job to protect its children, and this should be kept from children until they're old enough to process such things with more sophistication. So he wasn't the bad guy I thought he was.
Okay.
And oh yes, let's quickly look at slide 43, which is part of why I hated him. He was responsible for whipping up the parent-teacher associations, the local churches, the politicians, as comic books being the menace, and it led to these kind of auto-da-fe's bonfire of the comics. So this was where I went to college, Binghamton, New York. They would get all the kids together, the comics together with the parents, and have a giant bonfire getting rid of them. So it made me be ambivalent, let's say, about Wortham.
So, I think we have to go to psychoanalysis.
Yes, immediately when I get to New York.
You started our talk with the art of losing, and I think this was very touching. And there is an obvious similarity to psychoanalysis, which, among other things, tries to make grief possible, also by bringing something inexpressible, unspeakable, closer to language. In Maus, there is a passage in which you describe parts of a therapy session you had with your therapist, Pavel. Even if his interventions sound quite unusual. I was very impressed by them, especially where he tries to get closer to a traumatic experience.
Could you unpack that? I didn't know which part was the traumatic experience.
The traumatic experience is something in the center, and
okay. But the sequence you're talking about is on the right-hand side of the page, 40 of
no,
slide number.
No, it's the next one. It's the next page.
It's 53?
Yeah.
Okay, well, let me look at it and see what we mean. Ah, yes, okay, good. All right,
okay.
I'm with you. Mm-hmm. And also, one other question for you is, what makes this unorthodox? Because he was the only psychiatrist or psychologist I met who helped me. And I've been to at least 5. He was the most unorthodox, and he was by far the most effective. The rest were just a waste of time and money.
It's rather unorthodox to do what he does here, to cry, to shout and say boo.
So Pavel was a survivor of the camps as well. He was in Auschwitz. Before that, he'd been in Terezin. He was like an educated, much more empathic incarnation of my father. So if you want a transferal figure, that's why I gave him the same glasses Vladek has in the book and the mask that he has. And I was able to see him and ask, after my father died, I was able to continue the conversations with him and often get much more lucid answers, things that helped me more. So I guess that's not, usually you have to transfer on the father figure much more abstractly than I did. It was, he was there for it, you know. And after that, I just got involved with, it would take me sometimes a week and sometimes a few months, and sometimes because I didn't want to hurt the psychoanalyst's feelings, I stayed much longer than I should have. She had a lot of separation anxiety about me leaving. And there was another one who, when I had my first session, I knew she was a Lacanian, so I had to read up about Lacan before I went. And so I read a bit, and then it was our first session, so I was trying to catch her up on what happened to me. I said, well, you know, my parents were in concentration camps, and this happened, and that happened, and I was in a mental hospital. And then I said, and my mother committed suicide. Now, this was all trying to say it in the first 5 or 10 minutes so that we would have the ground that we had to cover. And as soon as I mentioned my mother's suicide, I said, fine, I think we should stop here for today. And my response was, I would be much more impressed with Lacan if he invented the long session instead of the short session. So that one didn't last that long.
He did these long sessions, I think. But
well, it wasn't what she took away from it. So, yes.
Let's go to dreams.
Okay.
Comics offer something that dreams cannot. Comics can be viewed together, whereas we can only ever dream alone. In your book Breakdowns, you draw real dreams. So, did you dream these dreams? Or
yes.
Do you call the dreams real to emphasize the closeness between dream and reality?
Well, for me, yes. I mean, I didn't do every dream because I'd never have done Mouse because I tended to have, I was a dream factory for a while. Now I don't remember them anymore. But at the time, I was dreaming a lot and thinking of making comics about them. And when I did the first one, which isn't the one we're looking at, so this, is it okay to not read this? Do we get what we want from this? Now this one, okay. So when I started the Real Dreams, I invited people to send me their dreams to illustrate. And I gotta confess, I'm too narcissistic to have gotten interested in their dreams. So I would read them and it would be kind of interesting, but it didn't impel me to want to draw them. So I just kept with my own dreams. This one was based on actually on a real dream, but I ended up using it as a framing device because it was so obviously a Freudian dream called Real Dream. And in the first panel it says, and the word real is just written in script. Dream is written in patterns in that first panel. And I'm moaning, wearing a party hat. Infected minds to their deep pillows discharge their secrets, Lady Macbeth. Then the big panel on top, I was at a party, I don't know what we were celebrating. Next row, the hostess weaved through the room holding a large sausage to her groin. Next panel, every few minutes she would shake the sausage vividly and vomit. The guests enjoyed the revolting display. Except me. Third row. I figured I might feel better if I washed my face, but when I looked in the mirror, good God, my mustache washed off. So I couldn't imagine a much more Freudian dream, but I had it as a dream. And it is drawn, as you see, the style is a bit different than, it's more like woodcuts and like German expressionist or Neue Sachlichkeit styles. The grotesque woman with the large sausage, which is called, the second time it's shown, it has the word kosher on the sausage, and so on. So the dream itself seems rather transparent, but then I give Dr. Spiegelman's dream interpretation in the bottom row, and that was, the party is obviously the Nazi party. The hostess bears an uncanny resemblance to Odilo Globocnik, head of the Polish SS. The sausage, a Polish sausage, is roughly the same shape as a map of occupied Poland. The revolting display symbolizes the tragic uprising of the Jews of the Warsaw Ghetto. And when the dreamer attempts to wipe away the horrors of World War II, his mustache, he is nevertheless left face to face with the naked truth of his own guilt. We must never forget the 6 million. So, in a way, this was the conscious version of what I found when I was looking back on that Lost strip, which was also saying, oh, there's a connection to losing on such a large scale. That started out as making it as a joke and then finding out what lay behind the joke. Mm-hmm. So it kind of showed the Freudian thing by just being there. That's, like I said, everybody in America from Alfred Hitchcock on was very much more interested in Freud than in Marx. So it was easy for people to translate the sausage as a phallic symbol and so on and so on. Mm-hmm. So that was a real dream. But one thing behind it all was I liked dreams in comics. So page number 55 for a moment. So there on the left is something I'd seen before and then saw again in the catalog you made for this show. And I'm very curious to know, what was that? Was it ever in a Freud book? Why did it find its way into a book of Freud's? Do you know anything about its history?
We found it in... No, you just go ahead. Okay.
But
yeah, originally it was found by Sandor Ferenczi, who found it in the Hungarian magazine, and Freud included it down in the, I think it was the first edition of Interpretation of Dream.
So it appeared after the Interpretation of Dreams had been published, but
Freud edited different, several versions, several editions of Interpretation of Dreams, and changed the material, his dreams.
Incredible.
So,
well, for me, this was like a revelation when I saw this, because if one has to deal with the masterpieces of comics, if there can be such a thing for a medium that's not considered high art, Little Nemo is probably the thing that comes the closest, and this artist named Winsor McCay. This thing, when I first saw it, about a kid urinating an ocean, was like, well, if the newspaper would have allowed it, I think Winsor McCay could have drawn it. And around the same time, he was making a comic called Dreams of the Rarebit Fiend. And it had no ongoing character. It just had a symbolic substitution for LSD, which was rarebit cheese. If you ate Welsh rarebit, you'd have nightmares. So each one was a different nightmare with different characters. And they were 1 page long, and they were very inventive. This one, for example, is seen from a point of view that didn't exist in cinema yet. It's looking up from a prone position at the people above him who are actually at his funeral. The character who's being talked to is in a deep hole, and people are looking down and talking about him now that he's dead. And the wife is going, oh, I'm glad he's dead. And her boyfriend says, yeah, me too, now we can finally be together. And then by the very end of it, they're throwing dirt on his tomb, and he's gone, and then he wakes up screaming. So these are very vivid and very amazingly well conceived pages. He was inventing a lot, and he drew like a master. His more famous comic strip was a comic for kids about a character named Little Nemo who went into the land of wonderful dreams. They're among the most exquisite printed objects made from any time, with a drawer who is uncannily masterful. He's also one of the fathers of the animated film, really the most important father of the animated film. So these things kept me interested in dreams and in him as a master to try to understand when I was becoming a comics artist. And that's what led to my few real dreams.
Okay, so I'll ask just one more question, and then I'll open up our conversation to questions from the audience. very last question about jokes. Freud discovered similarities between dreams and jokes. Both use similar techniques and both include infantile thought processes. I think you are analyzing jokes in your way, and perhaps you can tell us a little bit more on this. In your comic Cracking Jokes, we might look at this, and I'd be interested if your own relationship to psychoanalysis is an ambivalent one.
Well, I would like to say that my reaction to almost everything is ambivalent. It's my basic mode. And also I should say that I knew you were going to ask me something about analysis in comics, and I have to say I tried both, and comics is a lot cheaper. But I was very interested in reading Freud, certain things like he wrote about humor, he wrote about jokes in the unconscious, and so at some point I had the idea not to make this at first, but I wanted to make an essay in comics form, because the drawing in comics is usually very symbolic, they're diagrams, and when you write certain kinds of essays, even I think in the front of your catalog there's some kind of triangle that is trying to explain different kinds of violence. Maybe a cartoonist could do it more viscerally than just a triangle with writing on each side of the triangle, but for me the idea of, oh, well, comics are supposed to be funny, why don't I try to understand jokes? So I wrote a lot of different theories of jokes and came away wanting to do this essay called Cracking Jokes. And so it was a 4-page piece, and I found out that it was very electrifying for other cartoonists. It began a lot of other artists trying to do analysis in comics form, not of jokes, but there's one book that came out called Reading Comics by Scott McCloud, and he was in my class at the time, and he went, oh, you could do it in comics form, analyze what makes a comic a comic. So here, an inquiry into various aspects of humor. So the first chunk, the first chapter is half a page telling a joke. And so it's this Jack-in-the-Box with 3 penises for his jester's hat is saying, so there's this guy who thinks he's dead and his family can't convince him otherwise. And then an explanation that the child's Jack-in-the-Box is a prototype of the joke in its most primitive form, because a momentarily threatening surprise proves itself to be harmless. The child learns to master his fear through laughter. So this is a basic thing. And then after that, we now continue the joke, trying to. So this guy who thinks he's dead and his family can't convince him otherwise, they take him to a shrink who says, look into this mirror for 3 hours and repeat, dead men don't bleed. 3 hours later, the shrink pricks the guy's finger with a needle and holds the bleeding digit up triumphantly. There now, what does that prove? The guy looks at his finger and he says, dead men do bleed. And then it goes into a history of humor that goes back to the cruelty of making fun of cripples and of the baggy pants comedian who, having a small penis and large pants, could get away with saying things because he wasn't a threat. So that's on the second page. On the next page, I try some experimental variants on the joke. The one on the right-hand page starts with the analyst wearing the jester's hat, and it talks about stereotyped characters. Our joke is one of many that uses the stereotype of psychiatrist and nut. If these types are reversed, so the psychiatrist is not portrayed as an authority figure, our joke loses some of its point. And Freud in the photograph says, the caricaturist seeks power over the victim of his aggression by means similar to the witch doctor with his voodoo dolls. That's Freud. This guy thinks he's dead, so he's taken to a shrink who says, look into this mirror, but now it's the one who's the stereotype of the fool, talking to the shrink, who's, the Freud character is the patient in this one, and the fool is the doctor on the right as I retell this joke. So the foolish-looking doctor says, look into this mirror for 3 hours and repeat, dead men don't bleed. 3 hours later, the shrink pricks his finger with a needle, and as he pricks it, the sound effect says prick, and holds the bleeding digit up triumphantly. There now, what does that prove? The guy looks at his finger and says, dead men do bleed, and the fool then says, right. So, then talking about the castration imagery implicit in that joke on the left, and on the right it says, talks about aggression in jokes. Although we feel superior to the fool and laugh at his discomfort, if the joke's hostility is not well disguised, we begin to feel uncomfortable. So he holds up a chart saying, funny, oops, slipping on a banana peel. And then on the right, the clown says, I have cancer, and it says, not so funny. So then it goes on to be about violence. Maybe you want that one as well, or?
I think we should.
We have enough. Okay, so it analyzes different aspects of what violence has to do with humor and vice versa, and then what time has to do with all of this, but we're running out of it.
We can go on, but I think we have time for questions now.
Okay, fine.
From the audience. You need to raise your hands so that I can see you. There's the first question.
Hello, I'm very interested in your perspective on the gutter and its function in the medium of comics.
What was that word?
Gutter.
The gutter.
Yeah, especially maybe in the context of psychoanalysis, is the space of the inconceivable or the unexpressible.
Mm-hmm. I once had a dream. My mentor collected old Sunday comics. He's the one that gave me my job at a bubblegum company when I was just a kid. And so I stayed up all night at his house because he had all of these old comics. Little Nemo, nobody had ever seen it since 1906. He was responsible for it coming out. So there's a character named Happy Hooligan wearing a little tin can on his head. And it seemed like a strange character. And I had a dream, and I drew it, which is that every time I went from one panel to the next, I would disintegrate. And it would be painful. And then I'd come back together for the next panel. So I was moving in time, but the space between, which I didn't call gutters, but just the space between panels, was a dissolution, and then logic, or at least narrative logic and forward movement, came by reintegrating myself to do one more box of the story. And so I did that as a comic, as another real dream comic.
What's the title? Sorry.
What?
What's the title of the comic?
I think that, well, I think I have it in a book called Comics, but it originally appeared in an underground newspaper, and I think it was just called Hapless Hooligan instead of Happy.
Okay.
But I will say, this guy who made the strip about Auschwitz that I mentioned in passing, this artist who got interested in what could happen, so much so that he really pushed it further, he ended up saying in one very long and serious interview, because he was ashamed of being a comic artist because there was so much opprobrium around at the time, but he said, well, what's important is the space between the panels. Without exploring the space between the panels, comics can never become an adult medium. So this was, for me, like gospel, hearing from an artist who was that sophisticated. He invented lots of new ways of showing things, and from him I learned that you could make a different style in every comic that's appropriate for the story you're telling. So that's another cartoonist's opinion of what happens with those gutters.
Could you repeat the quote?
It's basically, the important thing is what happens between the panels. If one isn't free to explore that, there's no way to make a more adult comic. It's a paraphrase, but if you look up Kriegstein and comics, that quote will come up relatively quickly.
Yes, please.
May I ask two questions? Number one, going back to, two questions, coming back to Maus. Number one, did your father ever speak about the Holocaust and his experiences before you were interviewing him for Maus? Number two, I understand that your father passed away before you published Maus. Mm-hmm. What do you think he would, how would he have felt about his story being?
Well, he knew I was doing it to make a comic book. But the question about did I know anything before? I knew the stuff between the panels. I'd have a flash of being disintegrated when I was a kid. Like I'd hear a bit of a story, but not enough to really understand it, you know? And then he would go on to something else, and he didn't want to talk about it. He said, oh, people don't want to hear such stories. After the war, I tried to talk, they weren't interested. So it was just sometimes eavesdropping. I learned kind of passive Polish. So when they played cards, they'd say, oh yes, when you were there, I was in Bergen-Belsen, and it was just as bad, but I'd hear these stories without any context. And It's very confusing. And I didn't have a warm relationship with my father ever. So this was, I would hear it as literally almost as bedtime stories. The very first 3-page version of Maus, before I knew I was going to make a big book, was using these characters drawn more like animated cartoon pictures or children's book illustrations than the final one. But the first 3-page Maus was just for a comic book that said, you do whatever you want, but it has to be with anthropomorphic characters. And in the introduction to Breakdowns, which I don't remember if it's available in Germany or not, I think it was for a while, but in that it makes it clear that I didn't know how to end that 3-page story, but I came back to this New York, and in the preamble to Maus of my portrait of the artist, my father's playing cards, and he's looking at the comic, and he says, "Oh, that guy who turned us in, the guy, when they were in the attic, the guy who turned us in, you know, I buried him." I said, "What?" I'd heard the part about them hiding in an attic, but I didn't know that my father was well positioned in that ghetto because a cousin of his was the main Jewish policeman in that ghetto, and so he was put on the detail to bury the bodies, and the guy who was the informer to get a better piece of bread for himself was killed by the Jewish police, and that's how I got the punchline to my 3-pager. Otherwise I didn't know where I was going with it. My mother would talk to me about it, but also very fragmentary. It's not that she wasn't forthcoming, it's just it wasn't a subject that she would like to talk about. So the one thing that I actually remember, and part of the problem for me when making Maus, is her diaries were gone, all the stuff she wrote that might have given me a way into her side of the story weren't there. But one of the anecdotes I didn't know what to do with, literally, was I was a kid, we were walking to a supermarket that was about 8 blocks from our house in Queens, and then when we're getting 2 blocks away from the house going to the supermarket, she says, "I have to use the bathroom." And then she said, "I have to decide whether to try to use the one in the grocery store or to go home. We're closer to the home, let's go." And she was walking really, really fast. But as she was walking, to keep her mind off her problem, which was her bladder, she'd say, "You know, in the camps you couldn't piss whenever you wanted." I barely knew what the camps were. But she said, "You know, you could only piss in this kind of latrine when they said you could, at the beginning of the day and at the end. And to be found pissing on the fields in the middle, it could be a death sentence." And that was heavy for a 8-year-old who had just finally managed to master his own bladder a little, you know. And then she said, "But you know, what they would do is the women would stand around you when you were working in the field so nobody could see if you squatted down and peed." So it's a nightmare, but it's a nightmare I couldn't have context for. And then I guess that became my 13-year-long mission when I was making Maus, was to do that. My father didn't see the book, obviously, but he knew I was working on it. And I thought he had zero interest. Like, sometimes I'd read some to him because he didn't really read comics. It's one of the reasons I became a cartoonist. And on the other hand, I'd find out, after he was dead, I found out from other friends of his that he was very proud that I was making this book about him. I think if he had been alive to see it come out, he might have had some problems with not always being portrayed heroically, perhaps, but I'm telling the story that he told me and my relationship to him, and as part of making an honest story, because for most, I was aware of it right away. When I was talking to other children of survivors, they said, "But you can't make your parents suffer." I said, "Yeah, but they made me suffer, so that's just the way it goes." But more than that, it was, you can't do, some of the things I'd seen about the camps turned the victims into kind of saints. You know, that they suffered like Jesus suffered or something, you know. And my formulation of this was, no, suffering doesn't make you better, it just makes you suffer. And so Vladek was a person. He had his very good points, his terrible points, which makes him like everybody else. And it was important to convey that, so it wouldn't be a hagiography, is that how you say that word? But a story about what happens to people. But he'd have been happy that it made money.
So that's one question.
You started out as an underground cartoonist, and in the beginning you said you didn't like the word graphic novel. And I think there's a quote by Will Eisner who said that comics as a medium is at its best when it's subversive, when it's underground. What's your view on that? And what's your view on the way comics right now are heading, like as a medium?
Okay, one of your questions that put somebody in the audience to ask. I didn't find any of Eisner's stuff underground except for its distribution. But I think that what was so attractive about underground comics is it was the return of the repressed. Because comics, when they started, were really anarchic. Like when they had the first comics in the Sunday newspapers, people were writing angry letters to the newspaper saying, Sunday is the day to go to church, not the day to read stories about kids who are pulling pranks and being mischievous and being bad kids, which is what they were saying the Sunday comics were offering. But it's what was keeping the Sunday comics energized and made people want to read them, adults as well as children, is that they were somehow forbidden. And I believe that slight sideways for a moment, I believe that what's subversive about them at all is mixing words and pictures together. It was fine in the Middle Ages, but as soon as people needed to become literate, you had to put childish things aside. So you could have a picture of an apple and the word apple, but after a while, once you know the word apple, you don't need the picture anymore. It's vestigial, because language is more rarefied. And it's very clear when you start looking at Protestant religions versus Catholic religions. The Catholic religions love images. I mean, I can't tell you how many men on sticks I saw, even today at the museum. But Protestants, they don't like it. They just like the stick, the abstraction. And churches were not meant to be celebrations of that kind. They were meant to be very modest, the Protestant churches versus the Catholic. And I think it's one of the problems in America, and maybe elsewhere, that pictures are charged because they're the devil's work. You can't contain them. Language you can contain. You can have 3 subordinate clauses in every sentence trying to undo what you said in the first clause. Picture's a picture, and as soon as it's there, it's immediately imprinted on your eyeballs. And that makes something about the medium, mixing words and pictures together, already unkosher. You're not supposed to mix words and pictures, meat and milk. And ultimately, it's their actual strength. Like at some point, Francoise, who reads science magazines while I'm reading comic books, said, there's something you'll be interested in here. There's an article explaining that children, babies, can recognize a smiley face, a have a nice day face, before they can recognize their mother smiling. So it means we're really, really wired to understand iconic imagery. It goes viscerally into the brain, which makes them hard to digest in a way, but that's what's there. So at least when you're co-mixing, maybe you're co-mixing words and emojis, but somehow it's a combination of visual signs and verbal signs. So that's what led, I think, to Wertham, who I believe was an atheist but brought up Protestant one way or another, made him so scared of what these pictures were doing to the children. Now everything has become so visual in our culture that maybe it's a necessary evolution that comics be reintegrated, say, into bookstores, because if you can't understand pictures, you're going to be as illiterate as you were in the Middle Ages if you couldn't read. So there's that's subversive. Even before underground comics, after they cleaned up the comics and made them boring, they came back in the underground with all of the stuff that you were told specifically you couldn't draw. That was the agenda for the underground cartoonists. And now since, we've entered into this new, interesting, very well-intended puritanical age that started out really suspicious of comics, but the kids who were growing up had been reading them. And what happened as a result is it became clear that comics is the devil's language. Comics were born of caricature. It wasn't to draw neutral-looking people. It was to draw the tough guy. You knew that the tough guy always had a... Oh, could we go back to that picture that's earlier of... I'll find it, one moment. This is worth it. It's worth the trouble to find it again. Do you know the one I mean that was around the picture that had the Der Stürmer children's book? Before that one? Yes, there. Yeah. See, the nature of cartoon is you have to learn a vocabulary, literally. So in the middle, you'll see it says types. This was from a children's, from a book on how to draw comics and cartoons. So it shows you how to draw the black character the Native American, the Italian, the Jew, and it was a vocabulary. You had to have the hooked nose, or you had to have whatever. And these were all, if you said it in language, every one of them would be pejorative that would hurt somebody. That's the nature of caricature. In the bottom, there's an ad that was, in the middle, there's an ad that says, "Become a cartoonist." It was a really small space ad in Popular Mechanics kind of magazine from the 30s, when the cartooning was really a lucrative career. And what did they use as the one picture? It's a picture of a black person. So it's showing you how you can use cartoons to both injure and to attract attention and to make something that people will laugh at. And at the bottom it says, to sell this correspondence course, it says, trained cartoonists can earn $25 to $50 a week. This was from about 1912, I think. And for many cartoonists, that still remains true in 2024. But the language itself is one of danger. So on the left, I did an article for Harper's Magazine after the Danish cartoon controversy, and I was showing how, I was demonstrating on the cover, drawing blood, that this is the nature of comics, and then there's blood all over the drawing table. And what I did inside, among other things, was give the history of censoring political cartoons, and also of the cartoons that were published in a Danish newspaper to make immigrants feel bad. And I had to give it a rating. So it was 1 to 4 fatwa bombs. But mine wasn't based on the religious fear of, I think it's the Sunni Muslims hate pictures. They're like the Protestants. Am I right about that, or is it the Shiites? I think it's the Sunnis. So I didn't give it on whether this was a sacrilege or not. It was on how coherent is the cartoon. So I gave it 1 to 4 fatwa bombs. 4 fatwa bombs for something that was totally gibberish that you couldn't understand. And, well, if you could understand it, it got less fatwa bombs. But it was rated, each one, and showing it and explaining what it was about. This was still in a period where it could be dangerous. It was after the first wave, but Salman Rushdie got wounded after the first wave. But it was in the wake of those events that Harper's was brave enough to show that. And somewhere in there, I found this. Those 2 pictures on the right, which I think are made bigger in the next picture, is that true? Yeah. This was from a children's book made, published by, I think, the Sturmer. I think the cartoonist is named Phipps, very talented cartoonist and a monster in his own way. He was the main cartoonist for De Sturmer. So this was from a children's book, Never Trust a Fox in His Lair or a Jew. And on this page you can see an Aryan worker and a Jew. So pop quiz, which one is the Jew? Okay, I knew I was coming to an anti-Semitic country, but you all had the same thought. So it's because, you know, there are Jews who are muscle Jews, who are blonde even. But that's the picture of the Jew, the hook-nosed, well, whatever that picture represents. And so this is the danger that comes with cartooning and is still there. And as a result, a lot of what I see now is unfortunately really bland. It doesn't know how to play with the danger and use it well. Like, I think, sorry to go back to Maus, but I know it's what brought you all here anyway. What I'm doing with Maus is using the anti-Semitic trope of the Jew as a rat, as a pest that spreads disease, that is underfoot, getting in the way of civilization moving forward. So using that and making the mouse be able to stand on his hind legs and be clearly a human behind a mouse mask, with a predator who's clearly a human but wearing a ferocious cat mask, because that's the natural predator based on having grown up with Tom and Jerry cartoons and others. So those were the paradigm. And then you were talking before about the pig mask. But for me it was mixed, because this, on the one hand it's clearly pejorative, but that's the fear my father had. When I was going back to Poland so we could look around at Auschwitz and find out, said, don't go, it's dangerous there, they kill Jews. I said, no, that was before, I'm trying to research my books. No, they still kill Jews, you can't go. So a lot of the Polish Jews especially came back terrified of the Poles, because there was a lot of anti-Semitism. Not always, but in the years leading up to the war and right after, there were pogroms in Poland. So that was part of it, but there was also, since one of my influences was George Orwell's Animal Farm. They're all pigs, but there's some good pigs and some bad pigs, and that was basic to the whole notion of doing Maus. And in one set of panels, there's a guy who's Jewish and is accused of being German, and it's just a matter of him constantly pleading that he's not a Jew like these others, that he's fought in World War I, there's so on. And you just see him the same in two panels, once wearing the cat mask and once wearing the mouse mask, indicating that these masks are not the person. They're masks, they're societally delivered. And so that was my problem. And finally, in the course of the story, I just began screwing with it. Like, okay, what am I going to do? I have to have British people are present for the liberation of Bergen-Belsen. So I just made them fish riding around in a jeep. And because, you know, they were an island culture and they liked fish and chips, but it was just two panels. I had to do something for the British. And that went several times in the book, several ways of undermining that caricature, but that caricature is there. The ferocity of the feline, the relative helplessness of the mouse, and the unclean aspects of rodents. That's all built into using these stereotypes that come with comics in a way that complicates it so it can't land as only something to make somebody feel bad. Phew.
Oh, there's one more question.
Okay.
First of all, thank you very much for an incredibly funny and wonderful lecture.
And thank Ulrike.
I'm wondering what it's like for you nowadays. In a culture, it seems so much it's important for comics to work within a culture where things are forbidden. Hence, Salman Rushdie, hence.
Well, right now it is very hard to make things that are forbidden because it's what I was starting to say. Well, they make the comics really bland now, and I'm not interested in that. So as a result, I find it very hard to find things that I need to make. And it's why I get frustrated with certain co-workers in the field who try to make a face that really is a have a nice day face. They can't give you the exaggerated features. If you make somebody who's got a heavy build, you're fat shaming. If you make a woman with large breasts, you're being sexist if you're a male cartoonist. It's really everywhere. And this is a dilemma. I keep trying to figure out how to do all this and get close to being canceled without being totally taken away to a funny farm.
Absolutely, that's one side. And what about a presidential candidate who has, on one hand, no humor, but where there's absolutely no censorship?
Yes, that's why the Republican platform is so tempting. I can be an asshole and nobody can stop me. So I think that's where he gets his constituency, Trump. And it's amazing that it seems to be so attractive. And it's so attractive, as I was talking with somebody about a little bit earlier in this talk, was this is what's happening worldwide right now. The statute of limitation has run out on the cliche of never again, and again, and again, and again. And now is replaced with, you know, maybe it's interesting to not have to think. Maybe it's interesting to like feel better than somebody else because you're the right color. And this is giving permission to that and giving permission to grab women by their pussies and all of the nonsense that Trump has brought along, because the repression from my side, my team, is too great. It's too much superego, not enough id allowing things to happen. So yes, it is a problem. It's slowed down my comics production a lot, and it's why I'm drawing Rorschach tests for myself.
So there's one more question.
Oh, okay.
And then we are finished.
Given what you said about blandness in cartooning, the way you
I'm
perceive
having
Sorry, can you hear me? Given what you said about blandness in cartooning nowadays, or in comics, sorry. Do you think there's still a place for an anthology like Raw? And how do you think it would be received? Because it was so influential and it was such a great platform for so many people who are now like...
All I need is that first adjective that began with a B in your first sentence. I couldn't...
Bland.
Blandness,
given
blindness?
what you said about the blandness.
Blandness. Is there room for a magazine like Raw? A different kind of magazine, but like Raw in some ways, which is the place that is otherwise the salon de refusé. The artists that we used in Raw were many times different from the ones I had been growing up with in the San Francisco underground comic scene. It was from around the world, and was finding artists who were making comics different than the comics around them. Like, the main thing that kept this group of comics together, it was like a Potemkin village that we built. Look, comics are made by all these people, each of which have a different language that they're speaking, visually and in terms of their content. And somehow, isn't it amazing that there's this society of being geniuses together? But it was, none of these artists knew each other, pretty much. So by presenting it, it was like a Potemkin village that became a real place. These people began to know each other, influence other artists. The main thing they had in common was they weren't like each other or anybody else, and they created a new zone. And that was the mandate for Road, because we didn't want to reiterate the underground comics. I think Robert Crumb was doing that with a magazine called Weirdo. We were trying to indicate, you know, except for the prejudice, there's not much difference between people who write without pictures or people who make pictures with balloons and smaller than a painting, that there's room for that to be accepted as a means of self-expression, comics as a means of personal expression. That was the important thing to put forward. Now it might be a bit different. Like, I think my wife and daughter made a magazine called Resist. It was when it was clear that Trump had been elected, and for election day, everybody was going to go to Washington, D.C. who could go and protest what had happened. And it was primarily for women artists, but I pleaded for permission to have a man cave in the women's issue, so a few of us guys could also make cartoons about how indignant we were about what was happening. And it was a mixture of cartoonists who were well-known, well-established, and some drawing for the very first time. And it's just amazing. She did it in about how many weeks? 2, 3? 6, okay. 6 weeks before Women's March on Washington. She got it made, she got it printed very inexpensively. Ultimately, I think, I may have this wrong, 50 or 60,000 copies were distributed. And we brought them and we're giving them away free throughout the march. And that kind of comics as social commentary, that goes back to the beginnings of caricature. It was very much a political language. Is probably worthwhile, even though sometimes it's easy to say it's preaching to the converted, but when you hit something visceral, it hits a nerve and it upsets people, and that's probably a good kind of upsetting people, that's useful. But when you use caricature, you're bound to upset people who might be your allies, and maybe that's useful too, so that people on the well-meaning, virtue-signaling left just lighten up a bit as an important aspect of how things move forward with cartoons. It's one possible direction, and it's a direction I like.
So I think that's a nice moment to end on. Thank you very much.
Thank you.